Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 54. Well, the contest of MyLife, Chassidus Applied, essay contest, is creating buzz in many different circles. A lot of enthusiasm. Essays are coming in, and I encourage everyone, men and women, all ages, lay people, mashpim, professionals, anyone, to please contribute and enter this essay contest. Besides for the ikr, the primary, which is the primary objective, as the Rebbe made clear 64 years ago when he assumed leadership, shvat, tovshin yud aleph, he said, the ikr of ikr, the primary objective is yefutzu meinesecha chutza. Everything else is a means toward that. What does yefutzu meinesecha chutza mean? To spread, to disseminate, to distribute the meinesecha, the wellsprings themselves, the wellsprings of Chassidus, of Primus Atera, chutza, to the outside. And as the Rebbe makes clear, outside doesn't just mean your midas. Outside doesn't just mean the outside within you, but it means the outside within the world. Chutza she'en chutza mimeno. But it also includes outside in the context of a language and a translation of the ideas of Chassidus into terms that the outside can relate to and can embrace, which is the core essence of what the whole purpose of this contest is. And to make the incentive that the Nefesh Abami should also want to participate and fool it into joining this effort, a $10,000 first prize award will be presented to the winner of this contest. Second prize, $3,600, and the third prize, $500 gift certificate. You can enter, and all the details on guidelines are meaningfullife.com/mylife/contest. An amazing Hashgacha Pratis happened this week, where it was brought to my attention an Igeris, a letter from the Rebbe, dated Yud Ches Tevis, Tovshin Tezvov, basically 65 years ago, in which the Rebbe writes to a mechaneches, to an educator of clearly young women, students, seminary, and so on. The Rebbe writes at the end of the letter, which is a fascinating letter itself, printed in volume 10, Chelik Yud of Igris Kedesh, page Reish Lamed Ches, Reish Lamed Tes is what I'm reading from, but the letter begins a page earlier, 237, page 237. So the Rebbe writes, Bekeshrim yema siri b'shvat habo. Inyan hoya shetatzia la'anoris v'al koponim la'kishishis shebehen shekol achas tichtev masa hanegeya be'ezem miktzea shel avedis kfei drushas meire v'chomi admur sichesav chulu v'chulu. Literally translated means that in connection with Yud Shvat that's coming up, because this is a Tevis letter, end of Tevis letter, in connection to Yud Shvat, it would be a good idea, it would be to suggest to the students, to the notice, to the girls, especially the older ones, that each one should write an essay that is related to some subject of the work of my father-in-law, his talks, etc., etc. Now, when I looked at the date of the letter, I suddenly realized that the essay contest was initiated and conceived literally 60 years to the day of when this letter was written. That week is when we came up with it, right? The week before Chavdalah Tevis, and when we announced it was right after Chavdalah Tevis. So you can interpret it as you see fit, but the bottom line is that the Rebbe clearly is encouraging the writing of essays, and it just vindicates, and actually more than vindicates, it confirms the importance of this, and a great way of encouraging and inspiring and motivating people. And I hope that everyone participates. May the best person win the contest. But everybody's going to win, because anytime you make an effort in spreading Chassidus in this fashion is definitely a winner, and I am sure this will spill over and hopefully into many different other ways of creating a real swell, a real information revolution in the context of Chassidus being spread to the farthest recesses of this world, reaching people. And the bottom line is, because I've heard the question people asking, is it really possible for me to compete with experts or with others? Everyone's an expert here. The goal here is to take an inyan Chassidus, apply it to a personal matter in life, contemporary life. This is not being measured on professionalism or academic excellence, is being measured purely on those terms as described in the guidelines and outline. And I'm convinced that there are people who will come up with something brilliant that will really take a Maimer Chassidus and really address a real issue that everybody can apply in their lives in a sustainable way, as I said, described in all the guidelines. So I encourage you to go to meaningfullife.com/MyLife/contest and submit your essay. The deadline is Rosh Chodesh Adar, which is another 2 weeks. And Hashem should help everybody to do the best they can. And hopefully this will be a critical shlav in helping toward the Yifutzah Osim Mar Del Malka Mashiach, as Mashiach told Baal Shem Tov when he would come. So, the one more thing that Rebbe actually adds in that letter, which I think is also critical to emphasize, he writes about that we see from experience that that when you draw students, that they get involved in work by making their own presentations, this evokes far greater enthusiasm and interest among their friends, which is also part of the same idea. Not to just wait for someone else to do it, but people themselves do it. And we learn on the job by being challenged. This is how we excel. And this is one of the ways that we can do this, by participating, by actually putting your energy and investing your strengths and your skills. And don't be hesitant, don't be fearful, be courageous, and go for it. You know, the Maimer Bos Lagani that we learned this year, chapter 5, talks about being crazy, good crazy. So this is a perfect example that we shouldn't just limit ourselves based on our own tentativeness or fears. Just go for it, and you'd be surprised what you may deliver. With that said, let us begin by talking about something that's timely, since Tu B'Shvat is this coming week, Rosh Hashanah Le'ilonis, or Rosh Hashanah Le'ilon, and it's also Shabbos Pasha Yisro. So let me begin with something that's L'chvivusa de Milsa, which means something that is unique and special. I'd like to share something that I probably not shared in public before. I had the privilege, as many of you know, working on the Sichos of the Rebbe. And in doing so, we had to prepare the Farbrengens. Many of them were not edited, many were edited, we posed all kinds of questions to the Rebbe, and as I've mentioned a number of times, I always took advantage of that position. Thank God. I wish I would have taken even more advantage of constantly challenging and asking as many questions as possible, as the Rebbe wanted us to do, in order to be able to evoke in deeper chidushim and giluyim and so on. And there are some things that the Rebbe wrote that till this day we have never really resolved, something that the Rebbe wrote that we couldn't find, and I've always registered in my mind those things that still need to be tied up. So I'd like to share this with the public, and maybe something that all of you can come up, and it's connected to this week's Parsha. We're going to read Yishma Yisro and the Parsha of Yisro, and the Rebbe in the Farbrengen Shabbos Parsha Mishpotim Tovshin Mem, he was speaking about the idea of Ein Adei Mishmiya L'Riyah, which means that hearing something doesn't compare to seeing something. And the Rebbe says, and Shidua, one of the examples that a proof of that is brought from Yisro. Because Yisro, even though he heard all the events that happened, but when he saw, then he said, Ati Yadaiti. When Yisro himself saw what the Eibishter did for the Eden, he says, Ati Yadaiti, now I know. So here's proof that even though he heard about it from a distance, which is what Mashmur Shama Ba, what caused Yisro to come, because he heard about Kriyas Yamsuf and he heard about different things that had happened for the Jewish people, that intrigued him. But Ati Yadaiti, when he saw with his own eyes, that Pasuk says, that's when he said, now I know. And the Rebbe said, why does the Medrash bring a raya from Dafka from Yisro? There are many places you can bring rayas that riyah, sight, is more powerful than sound. Seeing something is believing, as they say, more than hearing about it. So the Rebbe said, because Yisro was the Chacham, that it says clearly that he was a person who was a extremely philosopher, and there was no Chacham, no wisdom in the world that he did not master. As such, the proof from him is a far greater proof than if you'd bring it from someone else. Because a Chacham is a person who understands things. And a person who understands things is, Ezu Chacham, a Chacham is Einov Bereisheh. It's like he sees things. His understanding is very, very clear. So if you bring the raya proof from someone who's not a chacham, or not a chacham as like Yisro was, you could say, okay, he needs seeing because his mind is not that powerful. So his hearing something, when he hears about something, or he analyzes it, it's not as powerful as seeing it with his own eyes. But a real chacham, lav dafka, maybe someone who really can see, Ezu chacham areyas aneled, he's able to, through his knowledge, he's able to see, maybe their sight wouldn't add so much. The fact that it happened to Yisro, even though he was such a brilliant man, and all the knowledge and wisdom that he knew, and still Riyah had an effect on him, that really proves that Ein Adem Riyah L'Shmiya or Ein Adem Shmiya L'Riyah, that sound cannot be compared to sight, because even a person who has all the wisdom and understanding, still sight adds something. And that's why he said, Aiti, Dafki Yisro. That was what the Rebbe said in the Fabrengen. When we prepared the Fabrengen for publication, and we were writing it up, so obviously, as was necessary and demanded by the Rebbe, that the Rebbe wanted us to look everything up and make sure the sources are cited and noted and annotated and so on. As a matter of fact, one of my first Fabrengens I ever wrote, this may sound like a compliment, but it was actually more of an insult. It was a Parsha Boy Tov Shem Mem. It was just a few weeks before this one, and the Rebbe wrote on a psyche, he started editing it, and he wrote, Reshime Melulis Mamish Kamoy HaTape. On a Fabrengen of Shabbos, the Rebbe compared it like a word-for-word transcript, Mamish like the tape. So you could say, hey, that's a great way of memorizing. No, but it also meant it wasn't ready for print. It meant it was like it was a literal transcript, and publication needs to be prepared for print. Print is not the same thing. Shmiya and Riyah is not the same thing also in publication. You could speak well, but to write it down is a whole another art, an effort. But going back to this, so when we were preparing this Sikha, this idea of Yisro in Pasha Mishpatim Tov Shemem, we could not find the medrash that brings a proof from Yisro. We did find in this Pasha, there is, Rashi brings it later, when the Jews stood by Matan Torah, by the Har Sinai. So it says, in a Dei Mishmiya L'Riyah, when it talks about the hearing and the seeing of what they saw there. But there's no connection to Yisro. We looked at every possible place, Medrashim, then we started looking in Maimorim, and we looked in Shalah, and we looked in every place where maybe someone cites Yisro as a proof. Because the basis of the Rebbe's idea is only based on the proof. It's not just the concept. Without the proof, from Yisro, the whole case to be made that Dafki, he teaches us the power of sight because of how wise he was, and still sight adds something. Anyway, as much as we tried, we could not. So we finally wrote to the Rebbe a question. I wrote to the Rebbe that as we looked everywhere, so we could not find a nusach and a medrash or anywhere else where Yisro is brought as a raya for Ein Adem Shmiya L'Riyah. So the Rebbe wrote on the side, Kemedumani or Kemedumali. Meaning, it seems to me, I remember, my recollection is that I once wrote about it in my Rishimis. Sheyesh ma'avzeh mashu b'Rishimisai, in my Rishimis. Well, after all the Rishimis have been published, that we have till now, we have not yet found anything on that as well. So I'm throwing it out there, that if anybody has anything to say on this, if anybody has a place they may have seen, Yisro brought as a proof, please share it, either by email or in the forum that we have. That is also a place where you can submit your questions at meaningfullife.com/mylife. And be very appreciative in trying to tie up this knot, so-called a chayv we still have to the Rebbe, to find this Rishima where the Rebbe writes about it, talks about it. Okay, now, begeit a lesson from all of this, both of Yisro and Tu B'Shvat. Well, Chassidus has much to say on both of these matters. One of the Maimorim of Chassidus talk about why Dafke Matan Torah happens in a parsha that's called Yisro, of all parshas. Yisro was a Kohen Midian. He was a priest that was dabbled, and not just dabbled, as I just said earlier, he was a mastered Avodah Zarah of all wisdoms. Why is it necessary that Matan Torah happen after Yisro appears, and in the parsha that's called Yisro? So Chassidus brings from the Zohar that Yisro is from the word Yesar, additional. Yisro added a parsha in the Torah, which is a big thing. Yisro was a non-Jew. Yisro was, as I said, a Kohen, a priest of not Jewish faith, and yet he added something, because as the word Yisro also comes from the word Yisro Na'er Min HaCheshech, that when someone coming from the Cheshech, from the darkness of the world, from the secular world, recognizes the power of the truth of and wisdom of Yiddishkeit, of Torah, of God, that has some type of benefit, an additional element that someone in the light, so to speak, that does not have that transformative effect, cannot achieve. And that's why Dafke Matan Torah, which the mission of the purpose of Matan Torah was, as the Bos Ligani talks about, to bring the Shekhinah down to earth, Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai, the Bitla HaGzeira, to fuse matter and spirit, where we can transform a material world and turn it into a divine reality, divine awareness in the material world. Until that point, that integration was not possible. The Ovis achieved great heights, but they did not have the power to transform except the mitzvah of Bris Milah and a few exceptions. So in order to transform the world, you need something from the world to recognize and to accept. And that was what Yisro was the Makabah Patish. For 26 generations, the generations prepared the world for Matan Torah, especially the last 7 generations from Avram Avinu till Moshe. And Yisro finally showed that the world itself, someone that's a wise person, a minister, a priest of the world, recognized these truths. That made the world more of a keli, a container to appreciate, and therefore be able to draw down Matan Torah, which of course is a tremendous chiddush if you think about it. That it's not just that the Jews were prepared 210 years in Golus Mitzrayim, and that they went through all the generations, as I said, from Avram Avinu and all the work that they did. You needed a Yisro to come to finally do his thing, which tells us that the whole purpose of Torah is not just for the Jewish people. It's not just for a group, a parochial group or a partisan group. It's to transform the world, which is why by Sinai, when they were receiving the Torah in this week's Parsha, it says that Tzipor le'tziftzif, a bird did not chirp, and the whole world fell silent. And the nations came running to Bilam, who was the great prophet of their time, like Yisro in a way. And what's going on? And he said, Hashem eiz la'amayit and Hashem yivarech hasam v'shalom, that God is giving the Torah to his people. But it was a Torah that was affecting the entire world, which is the ultimate kavanah and purpose, is that the Torah transformed the universe. And when you look at history, it actually did that. The rights, the social justice, the human rights, the charity, and the other laws of kindness and justice that the Torah advocates has become today a norm. And very shortly, with Mashiach's coming, the entire world will finally consummate its purpose and plan that began at Kfar Hoya Leilam Me'enze by Matan Torah. We already had a taste of it by Matan Torah, which was the beginning of the process, as the Alter Rebbe says in Perek Lamed Vav 36 in Tanya. So the Parsha Yisro captures what our mission is today. Is that, as I discussed before about the contest, in every possible way to explain Chassidus, not just to the divine soul, but to Nefesh Abamis, to the animal soul. They say Rab Nachum Goldschmidt, who was a great masculine Chassidus, but he served also as a mashgiach in Nigla. So they asked him, you're so much into Chassidus, why are you a mashgiach in Nigla? He says, that for my Nefesh Abamis. My Nefesh Abamis, my animal soul likes Chassidus. And this is for my Nefesh Alikis, Iskafia, being the mashgiach. So the point of Chassidus is to permeate that even the Psari Echza Lekaz that Rebbe brings from Teres Sholem in the beginning of Kuntas and Yon Shal Teres Chassidus, that the whole purpose is that for my flesh I behold God. My flesh, v'niglik v'eda shavaya v'ro kol basar yagdav, as the Rebbe emphasized that basar, flesh itself, not just eine basar, not just the eyes of flesh itself should experience and perceive the divine. And through the examples that Chassidus gives, they're not just as metaphors, they're actually the manifestation of the divine in those metaphors, in those examples of our material lives. That allows us to get a taste of it on our terms, and through that we can abstract and grow step by step till we understand the divine on its terms, and there too continuously grow in that type of understanding. Just notice the Sikh in Tovshin Yud Shvat, Yud Beis Shvat, I should say, right after Yud Shvat Tovshin Yudalad, and the Rebbe says the following. The Rebbe says in these words that since we're going to be reading Parsha Yisro, that's the Parsha Matan Torah, so we have to remember that B'negei Torah Kol Chavtzecha Lo Yishvu Ba, nothing compares to Torah, and especially Primus Torah. And the Rebbe adds, and therefore it's prohibited, asur, that one day should pass that a person should not learn Chassidus. Every person has to have a kviyas every day in learning Chassidus, l'chol ha'pochos, a few lines every day. So the Rebbe said. So, now there's one place, but many other places the Rebbe talks about the same idea. And the Rebbe uses the words there that has to be in a form of a reintunken sich and a reinwarfen sich, in limud Chassidus, in like mei hadas atoyer, as mola oros deis Hashem, like a tefillin a mikveh. The mikveh mei hadas is the knowledge is compared to water, and learning Chassidus should be one that you immerse yourself at least a few lines a day. As far as Tu B'Shvat goes, because time is short, I'll just say one short thought from the Rebbe. Adam Eitz Hasada, a person is compared to a tree, which is the reason why we honor the New Year of Trees. Why is that negayah to us? The tree should honor it. Because number one, B'Shvili Nivrei Elam, the whole world was created for us Number two, we have everything in the world within us. As the Ovid Rab Nosson and the Medrash says, Elam Katan Zeh Adam, a person is like a small universe. So we have the daimon, we have mineral, we have tsemeach, vegetation and trees, all within us, both physically and also, of course, spiritually and psychologically. So there's much you can learn from a tree. Primarily, a tree has three aspects. It has roots, it has a trunk, and it has branches and leaves that bear fruit. We're talking about a fruit tree. Deep roots bear beautiful fruits. A tree, as they say, is the only thing that grows in two different directions. For to have a powerful tree, you find the paradox of a tree captures the paradox of life. And what is that? That on one hand, you wonder what's more important to have consistency, a solid foundation, or growth and movement and mobility. Take relationships. Would you prefer to have someone that's very like a clerk, always on time, perfect, always consistent, reliable, but no excitement, no adventure? Or someone that's full of adventure, but they're spontaneous. So spontaneity and consistency doesn't always work together. Of course, there's spontaneous dancing at 9 o'clock. We're not talking about that. A tree captures that paradox and tells us you can have both. On one hand, deep roots that are deeply embedded, and they are unwavering. They keep the tree grounded. At the same time, look what happens next. The tree, as a result, blossoms, branches out. And if it's a fruit tree, bears fruit. Pri eitze pri, and then a fruit bears other fruit. The seeds of that fruit can create another tree ad infinitum. So it's the foundational elements that create that solid foundation that itself becomes the springboard for us to grow in all different directions. If you don't have the foundation, you just have that sense of spontaneity and adventure that's very nice, but you're not going to be grounded. If you only have the grounding and you don't have the branches and the fruits, then it won't have that impact of growth and so on. So one short lesson from Tu B'Shvat we can all derive in our own personal lives. Psychologically, many, many lessons can be derived in this based on different personality types. Those that are more like sun people, more like moon people. The sun is consistent, but the moon goes through changes. And in Judaism, we try to teach, and we reconcile the sun and the moon, which is why we have a leap year, to reconcile them, because you need to have a consistency plus vibrancy. There's a theme of many sikhs when the Rebbe would speak about chapters like Nitzavim Vayelach. Nitzavim means Nitzav Melech, standing strong. Vayelach means movement. The Rebbe would talk about it also in the context of Bahar and Bechukesei. Bahar is a solid mountain. Bechukesei Telechu, movement. And many other places where the Rebbe would talk about the paradox and how they join together and actually complement each other. One of the topics we spoke about last week, and I want to continue, was about work and a job, about people working late, coming home late, and so on. So it was pointed out to me a letter from the Frierdiker Rebbe. The letter is dated Vov Teves Tovshin Gimel. I believe it's in the Miluyim, in the later volumes of the Frierdiker Rebbe. The letter is numbered 6,542. Vov Tovkuf Mem Beis. Just read the letter. It's a very powerful letter that Rebbe writes. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes that your wife wrote to me about you fulfilling her desire that you shouldn't work more than necessary. Number one, firstly, both the fact that every day you come home very tired and very late, and especially Erev Shabbos and Yom Tov. So I answered her at length that she definitely... I answered her at length, and definitely you value, and the way it should be, the behavior of your spouse and her concerns about you, that you shouldn't work so hard, that God should bless you, that He should be Yasmin, He should provide for you a plentiful livelihood, parnasa, a great parnasa, and benaklet should come easily. But nevertheless, the Rebbe writes, it can't clearly you can't, even with His blessing, bring yourself to just come home earlier. Even though in truth it says, Birchas Hashem hitasher. It's not your hard work, but it's the God's blessing that makes you wealthy. That the primary thing is the blessing of God. And a person only has to make a keli, a container for parnasa. And has to work hard. Asher keli tia tehera, migneva, v'divrei sheker. The keli should be pure from any type of theft and deception. And then God's blessing rests there. And the Chassidic Rebbe continues. And it says, 6 days you shall work and do your work. And Yom HaShishi, Erev Shabbos, a person should be that day as a kilu kol malachta chasuya, like all your work has been finished. You should have complete betachon and trust that God will give you everything you need. Ukeshalosh shas, the Friedrich Rebbe then is being practical. And 3 hours, and not less than 2 hours. You have to come home at least 3 hours, 2 hours in the winter, but to come home before Shabbos. And in the summer, lo yu'ucher misha haravius tzarech lachzor lebeisei. That you shouldn't come home later than number 4 o'clock. And therefore rest at the time from the work that you did during the week, and prepare yourself properly and your family for the Koved Shabbos, beautiful clothing, clean clothing, and it should be in a guter stimmung, in good mood, and the sameach is bnei breise, and you should be able to celebrate then the pleasure of Shabbos with your family. And then God will bless that from Shabbos it should spread over into the weekdays with health and parnasa b'teva, because we say in Zohar it says that Shabbos blesses the entire week. Wenn man halt ehrlich dem Shabbos, wird man gebencht a ganz Woche mit gesuntem parnasa b'achove. When you are faithful to Shabbos, it's a loose translation, you'll be blessed a whole week with gesund, with health, and parnasa b'achove, with plentiful livelihood. So I thought it was appropriate to read this letter, straight from Friedrich Rebbe, about work and understanding the focus of work. And as such, let's go over to questions that followed up on that matter, which of course affects us all because people work. We live in a world after Chet Tzadas. The Eibishter made that bezeis apecha teicha lechem, that we have to sweat, that we eat bread by the sweat of our brow, but we should never think that sweat of our brow is the way it was meant to be. That was because of the Chet. Had Adam and Chava, had Adam and Eve done what they had to do in Gan Eden, the work would have been done for them, and they could have just focused on spiritual growth and emotional and intellectual refinement, and transforming the world of the L'Shamra and preparing it for the Geula. But since they did not, now you have to go and work hard in redeeming those sparks. But bezeis apecha, with the sweat of our brow. But it should never become our primary objective. It's always a means to something. So as such, question, we learned the idea of not getting fooled and worshipping the physical, material, external, but instead that we must connect to the higher power, inner energy, God, where the truth, blessing, and the source of it all comes from, as I just read from the Friedrich Rebbe's letter. So we are told not to invest our emotion, brain power in working with the unnecessary when we have access to the source, only our hands, not our head and heart. Referring to here, beloy lev alev, that it says that you should work biyagia kapecha. Your arms, your hands should work, but your mind and heart should be reserved, especially if they're the primary mind and heart, for higher values, for higher aspirations, divine, the Torah, mitzvahs, and so on. And that one head space should be reserved for Torah and mitzvahs. This is what this writer is writing. And he actually writes a bunch of sources. Why not? I might as well read them. It's a good sign. Mayim Rabbim, in the year Lamed Ches. Okay, the Rebbe speaks about Mayim Rabbim, the famous Mayim Rabbim, Mayim from Torah Eir. Mayim Rabbim refers to the Daigas HaParnasa. Mayim lo yochel l'chvusas ha'ava, which means that abundant waters, Mayim Rabbim, flood waters, cannot extinguish the love. So he explains the Alter Rebbe that Mayim Rabbim refers to Daigas HaParnasa, the worries of making a livelihood. So it refers to the Mayim, the Mayim in Lamed Ches, Tafshin Lamed Ches, the Rebbe spoke about it that year, Noyach, from this room. That was one of the sikhs the Rebbe spoke Motzei Shabbos from his room. Hayem Yem, 27th of Sivan. The story of Purim in the light of Chassidus. I guess he's referring to because Purim is a Yom Malacha, a day of work, elevating that work to Kedusha. The theme of Tanya, chapter 32. I'm not sure how that fits in here. I think he probably means chapter 37. Torah portion regarding the Mon, which is last week's Pasha, the Mon. As the Reb Marash says, Man is but panos in our times is like man lechem min hashamayim, and those that work in that business world know see the hashgacha pratis. And then he writes, here's my dilemma. Now that I'm in the real world, it feels like I'm living a double life. As humans, and especially Jews, our biggest asset is our brains. When at work, I give it my 110%. My headspace is totally there. When I sit down to learn, I'm totally there. How could I not give work my full attention? How could I come to work without brain power? How can we understand this teaching practically? Yes, absolutely, when things are theoretical, it's far easier to relate to. And the difficulty is once you go into the world and you realize the immersion, which is why I've discussed a number of times the Seder Hayom, why Mincha, the davening of Mincha is considered such a special prayer. As Eliyahu said, as we learned, the Gemara says that Eliyahu was not answered except by Mincha, because in Mincha, middle of the day, that you can tear yourself away from the work. In the morning and the evening, the prayers are before you work and after you work. But from the middle of the day, while you're working, like Yosef in Mitzrayim, while he was in Mitzrayim, and still you maintain the integrity, and you know where your head belongs. Not in galoshes, as the Rebbe Rashabet told that Chassid. That I see your head, I've seen feet in galoshes, I've never seen a head in galoshes. That's the ultimate goal. The whole Tanya is based on this struggle. Obviously, it would be a lot easier for us to insulate ourselves and run off into a kollel, into an environment, into an oasis, where we're protected from the challenges of the material world. That's what happens. That's our mission when we're children, when we're students in yeshiva, where we're being provided for. And that's when we are building up the resources. But then comes the kavanah of dira b'tachtenim. The neshama doesn't want to come down below. No person wants to necessarily go out into the world and have to deal with the hostility, the tensions, the competition, the challenges. Eretz eicheles sheshveh, it's a land that consumes its inhabitants. Yet that's precisely where we were sent to go, each in our own way. So I understand this dilemma is not your own dilemma, it's the dilemma that every one of us has, everyone in their own fashion. And this is the challenge that when you wake up in the morning, you have to set your mind and say, Moidani lefanecha, I'm going to reserve my mind and my soul, and I have to always remember while I'm doing work that the whole purpose of the work is to refine this world. Is that easy? No, it's not easy. So you simply have to find ways while you're working to remind yourself of this. This can be maybe opening up a sefer middle of the day, having something on your desk, wherever you may be working. That one of the Chassidim once said, they saw him saying Tillim during work. He says, if I could, so you have to be working now. He says, since I could think about work while I'm davening, I can think about davening while I'm working. This is the attitude of a chassid. This is the attitude of what the Torah expects of us. Is it difficult? Absolutely. The letter I read is that balance of knowing Birchas Hashem hitashir, and at the same time, Berachach Hashem alekecha b'chol asher tasa, is complicated. Because on one hand, it's God's blessing. On the other hand, you have to make the keli and you have to do something. So this is a challenge that everybody faces, and this, in essence, if you want to go a little deeper, Chassidus is the whole essence of what Chassidus teaches, the interface between bli gvul and gvul, between the matter and spirit, between the divine and existence. Bringing these two together is the challenge. So it's nice when you read about it in a sefer, in a maimer. It's a whole different story when you face it in reality. So when you're going out to work, think of it this way. I'm going to work precisely for this reason, to reveal the divine in the most difficult place of all, a place that distracts us and demands of our attention and mind. And you're not going to give 110%. You'll give everything that's necessary according to halacha. But bezeis, it should always remain sweat. It's not something that you run to with excitement. I would submit why so many people are so passionate about making money and about their careers is because they don't find passion in the spiritual. They don't find passion in a mission of their lives. If they did, then the work would be seen as a simple tool. How many people, for example, are passionate if you have to go and, let's say, knock in a nail to fix a wall in your home, or how many people are passionate about knocking in a nail? You have no choice. The only way to hang up a painting is you have to knock a nail in and hang the painting up. The only way to get certain things done is you have to use tools and a tool chest. You realize it's a means, and you realize what the end is. When we don't have an end, or it's not permeated us, that we know that we have a mission in this world, and then your work is not just a tool chest. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it faithfully. You should do it well. Use your ingenuity. Make money. But don't let that become the end and everything else the means. They tell the story about one of the fundraisers gets up at a dinner. He was the last one to speak, and he said, Rabbi Say, Bizitzt haben alle geredet wegen Teire, aber meinen haben sie gemeint Geld. Till now everybody was speaking Teire, but really what they meant was money. It was a fundraising dinner. Ich gehe mit euch reden wegen Geld, aber meine ich Teire. I'm going to speak to you about money, but I really mean Teire. So this is the point. Obviously, this was a good way to get, hopefully it helped. But the point is, what is the ikar and what is the tafel? What is the primary objective and what are the means to get there? And that's the whole purpose. Yes, dira b'tachtenim is the kavona, but not to become comfortable and say, oh, you know what, this is a great place to be. It's to know that you have to come here. But remember that the priority is transforming the world, not becoming part of it. And especially someone who's learned Chassidus, who understands Chassidus, knows that Chassidus comes to keep that awareness of a divine awareness even while you're immersed in this world. And there's no compartmentalization. Ein Eid Milvadeh means that everything is elevated. And that's how we maintain that. Now, practically, the advice I gave before and a few other things. Having a chavrusa, getting on the phone every day, let's say 3 o'clock, or lunchtime, or whatever it may be, talk to someone 10 minutes. The Rebbe said a few lines of Chassidus. Keep reminding yourself, the more signposts you have, the more you'll get it done. It's hard to do alone, that's why it's good to do it with someone else. But the more you're able to hold on in the middle of the day, remember, why are you here? And then, of course, when it comes Shabbos and Yontif, when you have more time and you're more with your family, that's the time when a person should really work very hard at establishing, why am I here? This is a good question you should ask yourself every morning. God returned your soul to you. Why? Almost everyone is going to come to the conclusion, it's not for me to go to work and make money. It's for me to transform the world. To do that, I need to go work and earn. Okay. Let's move on to the next question. The next question will be about, painful little question, but I felt it's important to address. My sibling hate is the way the person wrote the subject. It's even painful to say that, but we're trying to not mince words here. So my 9-year-old boy has an extreme hate toward my 4-year-old boy. Any ideas of how to deal with this? Yeah. So I looked around, could not find in the Rebbe's letters or in any of the Rebbe's Beim's letters and Sichos direct reference to this, even though it would have been, of course, helpful. If somebody does find something, please pass it on, as always, to meaningfullife.com/MyLife, where you have a forum, you can pass anything on, or send me an email personally, Simon, my name, at meaningfullife.com. But I will extrapolate from different things in Chassidus and Torah about this. Obviously, the word hate is a horrible word. When it's used in context of a sibling, it's even more horrible. Leisisna. We have a clear Torah directive that says you shall not hate anyone. The word hate is a cancer. It's a poison. It's toxic. Not just for the one you're hating, for you, the hater. So when we see people hating, adults and definitely children, we have to do everything possible to eradicate it. Even if there's a behavior that seems to be questionable or problematic, we don't hate it. The Alter Rebbe speaks about this in Tanya Perek Lamed Beis. You may hate the act, but you don't hate the actor. May the sins be erased, not the sinner. The word hate is not something that should be in our vocabulary. But I want to address this specific, I want to broaden it. So we have to do everything possible to eradicate it, in the sense when a person has hatred, it means there's something dysfunctional going on in their lives. Neshamas don't hate. Souls don't hate. Neshamas lamaila, without bodies, the concept doesn't exist. What is there to hate? The only thing you could say is they despise, as a tzaddik gomer despises ra, despises anything that is against the divine. But that should not be confused with the hatred, the petty hatred that human beings have. That's a despise. That when you love life, obviously you hate death. But the hatred of death is more that you completely find it repulsive, because it goes against truth. It's like someone says, I hate sheker, lies. That's not the personal hatred that spills over into personalizing. You can disagree with someone adamantly. You can even say, I despise that approach, but never apply it to the person. So when he speaks about sin and Tanya in that sense, in Perek Yud about the tzaddik, and then later, as I said, in Perek Lamed Beis, when he talks about Rishayim and so on, it's not about the personalization that we say, I hate these people, this one hates. Today we find in society people who hate each other, racism, discrimination, biases, prejudices, and so on. So if a person does have hatred like that, it's an indicator that there's something in their psyche that needs healing. Let's say it straight. How do they get rid of that? Why do they hate? It's often they feel someone took something away from them. They feel lack of self-esteem, blaming others, starting to hate anyone that has something that you don't have. These are forces, these are very, very despicable midas that a person has to work on. First to at least repress and then hopefully to eradicate and eliminate. Now, this particular question, I would say the following. I don't know the circumstances. Sometimes this is sibling rivalry in the sense where a child is getting more attention. Very often you'll find when a new child is born, parents are extremely careful that they shouldn't put all the attention on the new child because it sometimes creates jealousy. Children are used to getting attention and now the new baby is getting all the attention. So is it an outgrowth of that? Possibly. I can't say because again I don't know the circumstances. If indeed it is an outgrowth of that, then the solution is a simple one. Well, let's not put it so simple. He's already 9 years old and a 4-year-old. But you have to reverse it immediately. The 9-year-old is, I believe, crying out for attention. And it's expressing itself in the hatred to the sibling. So you have to do everything possible, not to talk necessarily about the hatred, but to feed and nourish and nurture this 9-year-old child. Bring love to him. And to the point where you water him, that he feels nurtured, then that will hopefully dissipate some of his negative feelings. If that doesn't work, and there are other factors involved, you may have to take him to a doctor, to a psychologist, to see if he has some type of imbalance, some type of chemical imbalance. Now, I'm not running right there because I'm not suggesting that that's the case, but you have to eliminate all the usual suspects because some people have a lot of attention inside of them, and it may express itself in hatred. And the most vulnerable person to touch is the 4-year-old. Also, that you don't write about whether there are other siblings and whether this 9-year-old boy has similar attitude or not to the other siblings, or maybe there are no other siblings. Regardless, it's too little information for me to really give you a full comprehensive response. But the 3 points I made hopefully can help. And if you do want to provide more, I'd be happy to address that as well. Now, obviously, this already borders on a topic that the issue many times, the advice I can give here, and there's advice that you must have a professional, someone who can evaluate and examine the child, the 9-year-old, and see what's going on. But there's no question that you can always do something about it. As parents, I commend you for writing, but more importantly, commend you to act on it, because you don't want this to become a bigger monster than it is. And it has to be nipped in the bud. 9-year-old is still, it's still young, but still, and therefore things can be done. So I definitely suggest that you do not be passive, act on it. And you have to get to the bottom of what is driving this child, how he behaves in school. Does he show this hatred to other students, to other friends of his? Or is it exclusively only to this 4-year-old? I mean, all these questions must be answered to really be able to give further advice. But let's just sum up again. Sinna, hate, is one of the worst midas. And it eats you up alive. More than the damage you can do to others, the damage it does to you. You get filled with this toxic energy that's a negative. And as the Alter Rebbe speaks in Tanya, Perek Yud Beis, when he speaks at the end there, Tina V'Sinna, he talks straightly how to get rid of a grudge, how to get rid of hate, something we've talked about as well. First, the idea of Moyach Shalt Alev, cognitive conditioning, emotional conditioning, behavioral conditioning. All these are forces that can help a person get through it. Behaviorally is in actions. Cognitively is like a different mindset, finding things that you enjoy, that you love, that channel the energy instead of to hatred, but to something kind. Encouraging a person, rewarding them for kindness. And then, of course, emotional conditioning is simply to get their hearts going and exercising the positive part of the heart as opposed to the negative part. So there's the cognitive side of it, which is more intellectual, like, setting your mind to something, and the emotional is ultimately the place you want to transform it. And as the Rebbe makes it clear in many places, including Bas Legani Tovshin Tezvov, said 60 years ago, that we have the power not just to control, not just to weaken, but to transform even the even negative passions like hatred towards something positive. So with that said, let me go over to another topic which I promised I would speak about in the previous week, but now we'll at least begin to address it, and that is the concept of the anatomy of evil. Theodicy according to Chassidus. Theodicy according to Chassidus. Theodicy is a word that is used in the discussion, the philosophical quandary of a good God and evil. And there are many schools of thought that address this question, but I'm going to address the question that person asks is, if Chassidus teaches that all evil is really good, then why do we look at the evil as bad? When terrorism or bad people do bad things, shouldn't it just be looked at as good? How does Chassidus look at evil? If God is good, why does evil exist? Another questioner asks, can you address current events according to Chassidus, Islamic terror, namely? I'm specifically referring to the rise in Islamic terror, particularly ISIS. How can I deal with the fear I feel on a constant basis? What does Chassidus say about such pure evil? Is there any good? Yesher koach for your wonderful work. Okay. So let's break this into several parts, and I'll begin discussing it, and I'm sure we'll need more time to address it fully. I'm not going to go through every philosophical school of thought, but just broadly, let's just, for contrast purposes, Yisro ne'er min ha'cheshech, as I mentioned before about Yisro, a great way to appreciate Chassidus is by comparing it, simply by contrast, to see Yisro ne'er min ha'cheshech, seeing how others look at this issue. So if you look up in general schools of thought about good and evil and God, one response is that evil is an illusion. And therefore a good God did not create evil. Evil is an illusion of the mind. Another response is that the other way around, that God did not create evil, evil is created by human beings, and God takes a back seat. I'm not going to give the sources for each of these approaches, but clearly, as you can understand, the Torah does not accept both of those, and Chassidus does not accept both of those. But both of those are trying to reconcile the issue. If God is good, how could He allow or do evil to people? How could there be evil? How could He create evil? And you see, evil is in the sense of injustice, innocent people being killed, and so on. Then comes, of course, the answer of free will. In order to have free will, God gave the human being the ability to do good or evil. Where the goal is, b'charta b'chaim, you should choose good. But there has to be the possibility for evil. That only, however, explains the reason why there is that will. But this still doesn't explain, philosophically, if God is ein eid milvadeh and consumes everything, how is there space for evil in the context of goodness of God? So Chassidus generally goes and explains the following. First of all, quoting some sources, the Pardes of the Ramak talks about it, but of course the ultimate answer is going to be connected to the Tzimtzum Harishon of the Arizal, because this is one of the dilemmas he came to address with the Tzimtzum. To say that it's a complete illusion, the reason you cannot say that is because then the whole Torah talks about that there is two options. And if you say it's an illusion, you're basically dismissing the whole idea of punishment and the whole idea of actually doing something wrong. You could say there's nothing wrong, like you're saying here. Who says it's wrong? Just because our mind doesn't like it or our feelings are hurt when we see senseless pain or senseless killing, who says it's wrong? It's an illusion. Clearly that's not the case. The Torah says clearly that God created a world, delineated and said this is right and this is wrong. Esa and leisasa. And to suggest that, God forbid, to do something negative is just in our mind is basically undermines the whole basis of Torah. Even those who distorted Kabbalah by saying, we took Shabsai Tzvi, Jacob Frank, and saying that you can find, based on Kabbalah, that the deepest sparks are in the darkest places. So therefore we have to go initially and go get those sparks. And they institute all kinds of inappropriate and obscene methods of going to redeem sparks in the darkest places in Sholosh Klippos Hatmeis. What's wrong with that? Because it's not, it's Sholosh Klippos Hatmeis. Like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya and Perek Zayin, Osur v'kosher b'dei chetzein. That's what the word Osur means, Isur. Why is it called Isur? Isur means forbidden, but also means bound. Because the spark, and everything has a spark. Even Shalosh Klipos Atmeis, as the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Rashab make clear that the end of Tanya, the first chapter of Tanya, where it says, Shalosh Klipos Atmeis she'ein behem tev klal. They have no good at all. They make it clear, mitzad atzmam, ba'atzmusa, on their own they have nothing. Why? As one of the examples that Rebbe Rashab gives, in Vayigdol Na'orim, Samachei, there's Maimer in Ayin Hey, Padav Shalom, other places that the Rebbe cites, that the spark has become like a chaticha nasan avela, which means a kosher piece of meat, but fell into a big pot of an unkosher meat. So it's still kosher technically, but now that it's become consumed, you cannot any way free it because it's now become completely submerged. So the spark is completely trapped in a place that you can't redeem it. Echte v'ashuv. If someone says, I'll sin and redeem, it's not acceptable. So that clearly this means there is things that are asur and there are things that are mutter. So it's not an illusion. But then comes back the question, how is it possible in the face of a good God? So again, why there exist these two options, free will. But how? So here you have to go into the dynamics, the mysterious dynamics of how God so-called conceals himself in existence. So basically, and this is also taken from sichos like Noyach, Tovshim Mem Ches, the Rebbe says, Ha-magbi yodei al chaverei. A person lifts his arm to another is called a Rosha. The Rebbe speaks there at length and brings from Teira Shalom the idea of how evil emerged. So in Teira Shalom, the Rebbe Rashab says, and this is based on different Maimonic Chassidus, that Ra is mitziyusei heder. Mitziyus of heder. It's a non-existent reality. This is not illusion. It's a mitziyus, but it's a mitziyus of heder. Think of it like negative energy. There's positive and there's negative. When you don't act on it, a person sits and does not do a sin, it's like they do a mitzvah. Why? Because there's energy there. And when you avoid it, you're freeing it because that's why it was put there. It was put for you not to do it. Like Yediyas HaShlila. Loisaseh. By not doing it, exerting energy and avoiding being tempted by it, refraining from doing something is also energy. Your energy, in a sense, frees that spark. So it's mitziyus of heder. Something inappropriate, mitziyus of heder. What happens, God forbid, if a person does it, acts on it, or perpetrates something inappropriate? They've now given something of heder mitziyus. So you've taken something that was a negative energy and you've given it positive energy. Now you've taken something that was meant to be nothing, meant to be non-existent, meaning non-existent by you avoiding it, and now you've given it validity. And once you give it validity, now you've really created a distortion. So there's two stages in a sense how evil is produced. One is a concealment, and if we're wise and we avoid and refrain from acting on it, then everything is fine. You reveal, the example given, a father hides from his child in order to elicit the ingenuity of the child to discover the father. The child starts looking and looking and looking. And the Rebbe brings one sichos, Zunti gesucht, Monti gesucht, Dienstag gesucht. Searched on Sunday, searched on Monday, searched on Tuesday, doesn't find the father. At some point he gives up. So what's going on here? The concealment, its intention was not that he remained concealed. The concealment was meant for you to work hard and find the father. But once you give up, you give the concealment true value. Instead of it just being a means to elicit your ingenuity, now the concealment becomes a mitzvah because he remains hidden. And now you've given it validity. In Chelik Vov, L'kutei Sichos Shmos, the second famous Sikha about the Taimei Abriya, so he says there that the Chiddush of Dira B'Tachtein, Shviras HaKlippos, is that you make from heder a mitzvah. Exactly what I said before. That when you do not act on it, or as Deinas Nasa Gezochis, you do the tshuva properly, you make from heder mitzvahs. So this is the goal to understand what it means the mitzvahs of heder. Had Adam and Eve not eaten from the tree of knowledge, it said, do not eat from this tree. It was a leisaseh. This tree is not for you to eat. That means that by not doing it, you fulfill something. Heder. They're not doing. There are things they're told to go do. Eat from the tree of life. Do this mitzvah, do that mitzvah. There, the point is revealing the galakus and the mitzvahs of the thing. In Ra, the point is to avoid it and reveal that the thing was only meant for you to avoid it. So like he brings in Teira Shalom that when God wants something, it automatically creates something he doesn't want. Because in a world of structure, desire for something implies the non-desire of the opposite. I desire something sweet. It means I don't want something that's not sweet. I desire good, but inevitably it creates a shadow energy called the energy of the negative. Now, if you avoid that negative, then it fulfills its purpose. So essentially, the tzimtzum addition, God concealing His presence, the purpose was not tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is not kipshute, number one, it's not literal. Number two, tzimtzum is not the kavanah for itself. In Ruach HaMesh Lim Tov Reish Tzadik Hey, the Rebbe explains, it's not a tzimtzum, it's not for its own purpose. It's tzimtzum b'shvil hagilui. The Father is getting concealing in order to reveal. What gives Ra power? When you buy into that, I don't want to call it illusion, because I said it's not an illusion. When you buy into that concealment and you give it validity, and you say, oh no, that's the state of affairs. You know what? Everyone's doing it. This is the way it is. Once that happens, then you have problems. The Rebbe said more than once, but I remember once the Rebbe saying, everybody has flaws, but don't make a philosophy out of them. The fact that there's concealment in this world of the divine, yes, but recognize it as concealment, and that's the beginning of the revelation. Recognizing that this is not normal. So therefore, bottom line is, disease is a negative, and it's negative energy, and it gets power when you give it credibility and you act on it. And you bring it alive. So you're taking something that was meant to be a not, and you're making it a yes. So that's how evil begins. It begins with not energy, negative energy. Had we not acted on it, it would have a purpose. That's why a good God can create that. Because God is not in the evil. The whole purpose of the evil is the not being. And that's the reconciliation of Theodicy according to Chassidus. Briefly stated. Now I'm sure when you look into this and start thinking about it more, you'll have more questions. Because then what happens next is, once we give it validity, now it's become a monster. Now it's become a power. So you'll say, where's God in there? The answer is it's there because God has bound himself to our actions. So the nitzutz now is bound there, and the only way to redeem it is either avoiding it, but if you acted on it, then the only way is through tshuva. And tshuva requires very strong effort, because something that's locked and trapped, to get it out of prison requires a lot of energy. Perek Zayin, chapter 7, he explains what that means. Ave. And because this negative state of affairs brought the deeper thirst, hoyel val yodeh, because of that, you have the power of zdeinas nasalei kazachias, that you can transform even the negative into positive. But that's after the fact. Before the fact, avoiding is the way. So now, once it's there, it still has a spark. But the key condition is shvirosan zui takanosan. You cannot redeem it, the act itself. You have to destroy any of the negative element of it. You have to reveal again its heder. You have to heder. You have to destroy, and through shvirasan, through destroying that which was the evil part, zui takanosan, that's its repair. So firstly, that's again the statement, that from negative becomes positive. Destroying something becomes its repair. But here, it's two steps. You're destroying the act. You're destroying the levush, you're destroying the garment that the energy, the divine spark manifested in, and then you can free the spark, and it turns into a tremendous love and passion toward the divine. That is redeemable. So the God within there remains good, but the good has become concealed because God has allowed us, like you take the king's head and put it into the worst places. He gave us the ability to take his head, to take his sparks, to take his divinity and put it into negative places. So the answer to the big question is that, number one, God did not create evil. Ein ra yered milmayla. Mipi Hashem leiteitza haroyos. From God's mouth, evil cannot come. What comes is positive energy. Now, manifest positive energy immediately creates negative energy. It's an alter ego. It's antithesis. In Atzmos, which is built in Mitzias Nimtza, there's no a non-existential existence. There's no such thing. There's no possibility. But once there's a tziyur of kedusha, Once you define things in a certain way, definition by definition means there's another alternative. There's a second path. But the second path is meant to be a negative energy, not to be done. If you therefore, that's reconciled. A good God can allow such energy to be there because He's not expecting, doesn't want you to act on it. But then He gives you free will, and free will allows you to act on it, allows you to make it from a negative a positive, a bad positive, and for you to now fix that, now you need to do is take the negative and destroy it, reveal the negativity of the bad that was done, and redeem the divine spark that lies within it and elevate it. This is, my friends, the dynamics of theodicy and the approach from Torah to evil. Now, we still have to apply this when you see real bad things happening. How do we look at it? I spoke much more theoretical. I would not put this in the category of applied Chassidus. I would say maybe it's explained Chassidus. Applied Chassidus has taken this and applying it, which we will do, please God, in the coming episode. Since time has run out, and we have not addressed everything that was promised, I do want to conclude on a positive note that Friedrich Rebbe writes in Perek Hey of Bosel Lagani, and the Rebbe explains both Tovshin Tezvav and Tovshin Lamed Hey, twice when he explained chapter 5, this idea, Shtus de L'umazeh, Shtus de Klipa. Exactly what I just discussed now, the concealment of the divine. Ein Odem Ever Avera, a person does not do a sin unless they have a moment of insanity. Why? Because the divine presence would never allow. If you knew that your hand was in fire, was being burned, you'd never put your hand in fire. So there has to be a moment of concealment. That concealment allows you to convince yourself that this thing is not bad. From the divine perspective, it absolutely is off limits. But from your perspective, you can convince yourself it's not. So you can go ahead and say, okay, my next step is to see the light and stop following my insanity. Says that Perek Hey, no, the kavana ultimately is esapche. To take the insanity, to take the craziness, the foolishness, the mindlessness of following, like he says, azay tut welt, culture, customs, traditions that don't have any necessary intelligence to them. But everyone's doing it. To take that type of foolishness, shtuz de lumazeh, and even further, shtuz the real klipa would be actually doing things of Aveda Aveda. And there's an insanity involved. Not enough to stop the insanity. Take the insanity and turn it into insanity of Kedusha. Holy madness. Do something crazy. Give charity in ways you never would have ever done. Do something insane in Kedusha. Learn like you've never learned. Take Chassidus and do something revolutionary with it. That's the kavanah. And that's the purpose of why we're here. And that, the Rebbe says, is negeya in the kavanah of atzmus, of dira b'tachtenim. The whole purpose of the Deir HaShvi, to bring the Shekhinah down below, is not just the Shekhinah, to bring atzmus. And atzmus is les machshava tfisa beklal, beyond it all. How do you get beyond it all, beyond structure, beyond mind, beyond heart? That's called crazy. That's called insanity. That's called madness of Gedusha. Because you're reaching a place like Rab Shmuel, Rabbi Yehuda ben Elah, when they danced at the wedding, binyan adayad, koyach ein sof. How they dance? They dance completely out of Agbalas. Dancing itself is lifting both your legs, not just walking, dancing. It's a dance of Gedusha, a five from Gedusha, as the Rebbe spoke, Purim Tavshin Lamed Vav, about the whistling. Five from Gedusha. And initially, Rab Zayda looked and said, you're embarrassing us. Talmid Chacham behaving like this, dancing with the juggling of the three myrtle branches, or one myrtle branch, it's talking about the three with Rab Shmuel. And then later when he sees by his Levi, he sees the flame that separates him and Welt, which signifies that the Rebbe says, Hechef ha-Welt, Hechef ha-the Elam Helem v'Hester. Don't just look at the world, but beyond the world, and they realize that this is the shtus of Kedusha. This is the Veda of our times, because we live in crazy times. What I mean by crazy is people conform in crazy ways. And if you're already doing something that is beyond the rational, irrational, might as well do something that's beyond the rational, super rational. And that is what the Rebbe said, Chof Ches Nisan Tavshin Nun Aleph, 24 years ago, almost 24 years ago, where he said that maybe there'll be one or two that will become obstinate, einsparen sich, and not do and not leave any stone unturned until Mashiach comes. This requires Eidos de Teu and Kalim de Tikkun. Eidos de Teu are crazy energies. They're mad energies. They're madness. But madness that's packaged in a way that the world can contain. So it's packaged, it's camouflaging as Tikkun, but it's madness. Madness of Kedusha. Not madness that, number one, can be not from holiness, and number two, can be a madness that the world cannot contain. That's not the approach. So Eibishter should help that in the schus of Yud Shvat, and we're going now to Tu B'Shvat, and we're going to other special days as we go along, that we should use the opportunities that were given to us, the blessings of Chassidus, applying it. Your futsu also is like ufaratzta. It's wild, spreading everywhere. It's not one channel. It's in all directions, east, west, north, south. Your futsu, spreading it out, distributing it in the wildest possible ways, in the maddest ways, in the craziest ways, but in chutzah, in a way that's applied and relevant to the chutzah. So again, I encourage everyone to participate in this essay contest, the MyLife Chassidus Applied essay contest. There's a few more weeks for the deadline to apply a concept, an inyan, a maimer Chassidus grounded in a maimer. But to do it, use your minds, use your imagination. Do not be intimidated. Do not think that some others are going to do it and they may win. Everybody's capable of winning. Everybody. Because this is based on applying an inyan Chassidus to a real life situation that anyone reading it, a secular person, will say, wow, this is something to follow. This is something I could follow. This is something that can help my life. To apply and to read the guidelines, which you should do, is please go to meaningfullife.com/mylife/contest. This has been MyLife Chassidus Applied episode 54. Until next Sunday, from 8 to 9, everyone should have a very Chassidish week and a week of Geula, together with Vahu Yigalenu, as the Rebbe concludes in the Maimer of Bosa Lagani. Thank you very much.